Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for the first Percussion Community webinar of the 2018 season. My name is Caleb Rothy. I'm the Percussion Education Coordinator for WGI, and I'm really happy to have all of you joining us this evening, especially those that are joining us live and carved out a little bit of time in your schedule. I greatly appreciate that. And if you are watching a recorded copy later on after the fact, we appreciate you spending a little bit of time with us as well. Our special guest this evening is Chris Hestin. Chris is the percussion judge coordinator for WGI, handles all of the judge assignments and training and development and all the other things that go into coordinating those aspects for WGI, the training and the philosophy and things like that. Chris, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for the opportunity, Caleb. Love this stuff.
Absolutely. All right, so a couple of housekeeping things before we get started tonight. Everybody that's joining us live, we want this to be as interactive as possible. This will be most beneficial to you if we can make sure that we're speaking directly to the kinds of questions and things that are on your mind. So if you're joining us live, over on the side of your screen, you will see there's an area where you can ask questions. I would encourage you to use that feature frequently and often and make sure that you get anything that's on your mind typed in there. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible on tonight's live webinar, and so just keep those questions coming as we go through. Anything that's on your mind in terms of adjudication, how that works, how it works for the ensembles, how it works for the adjudicators that work for us, any of that kind of stuff that's on your mind, definitely don't shy away from asking it, because we're here to share as much knowledge and as much insight as we possibly can tonight. If you are joining us on a recorded copy and weren't able to join us live tonight, I do want to let you know that you can still interact with these webinars. If you will send questions in to me ahead of time, I can make sure to kind of get those in the queue and make sure that we're able to ask those during our sessions. So all you have to do is send me an email. My email address is Caleb, C-A-L-E-B, @wgi.org. Or if you're on Twitter, you can send me a message there. My handle is @CalebRothy, just my first and last name. So definitely make sure that you shoot us those questions in advance, because we want to make sure that we're answering all the things that are on everybody's minds. All right, Chris, how are you doing this evening?
Very cold, but very well.
I imagine that's true for most of us that are joining on the live feed tonight. I was thinking about this before we started, that with a whole bunch of school sites shut down for the day, there's probably going to be a whole lot of canceled rehearsals tonight. So as frustrating as that is, we hope that that means some of you guys were able to join us live that maybe wouldn't have been able to otherwise. All right, so we're going to dive right in. Chris, the first thing that's on my mind is the judge meeting that we had a couple of weeks ago, earlier in January. I'm not sure if everybody is aware of it or not, but we get together with the judges every year, weather permitting, and have a little meeting, a meeting of the minds, a chance for us to talk about philosophy and technique and pedagogy and all those kinds of things that go into the craft of judging. Can you give us kind of a little brief recap of the judges meeting that took place earlier in January?
Sure. This is something we hold very dear to the training process, to the team building that we have as the roster manifests itself year to year. First weekend in January, we typically set aside for all the judges to come together. It changes cities year to year. We structure the weekend where we have housekeeping business and global philosophy, and Ron Nankervis is there to give just the state of the union of WGI for the roster Friday night. And then Saturday, depending on the year, we break it up into different sessions. But we always want to target some element of the craft, be it numbers management, be it tone, be it commentary, be it critique. We always, throughout the weekend, reinforcing again the philosophy, all the information you would find in the first couple pages of the manual and such. We spend time in breakout sessions so that each of the 4 captions can just go into separate rooms. We do video reviews and just allow the dynamic of the room and allow the fluid conversation and allow everyone to hear each other react to things in real time. What that does, just to heighten everyone's awareness, really goes a long way to giving a greater in-depth understanding of each of the captions, but also just that shared language, just allowing the reactions to flow more fluidly as we do the live commentary and such. Come back together, we share what each of the rooms did, and then this year was, it had been a plan all along, but it was kind of moved forward by the advisory board that we have a guest speaker come in who's outside, not just outside of the activity, but in some way just to help give a continuing ed, give new perspective to the group. So we had one of those this year. Michael Medeo So as we lined up, thinking through what that session could be, I wanted it to be something that could cut across all 4 captions. We didn't want something specifically music driven because that would obviously marginalize the visual and vice versa. So something that would cut across all 4 captions that would be enriching to all of the judges, no matter what their fort, whatever their caption would be. So started thinking through more of the cognitive process of judging. What could we do? How could we get the judges to improve their reception, and also their retention? Because as we go through the process, we talk about the judges wanting to recognize what's happening, reward what's happening, being able to recall what's happening, especially when we get into some of the larger shows when we're dealing with 25, perhaps 25 groups in one class, all on the same sheet. It can be challenging as the day goes on to recall back what the second, third, fourth group did when you're looking at the 19th, 20th, 21st. So who could help address the entire room to better prepare the judges, or to give the judges better tools to take in more information at one time, to be able to filter through what's important, what's not. Then at a certain time, be able to recall that better. And then when it comes time to actually making the decision in that comparative process of finding a number, making decision between groups, so just to be able to heighten that skill. So a good friend of mine is in the human computer interaction. He's a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon. And he took us through really the science of decision making, the cognitive process, everywhere from the event to the sensation to the perception to encoding. He was careful not to go too much into the inner workings of the brain necessarily, more just specific to what would relate to us as judges. There's been examples outside of our industry in wine tasting, in gymnastics judges and Olympics judges, just the processes they go through. So that was the buzz of the weekend. That was the aha moment of the weekend, just getting that insight. It was motivating to realize so much of the work is done on the front end. Certainly different judges are at different tiers, different judges are at different trajectories, different judges have different experiences. But to know that we just as lifelong learners and then accountable participants in this fantastic activity, there are ways that we can be better on point in that day. Everywhere from just getting a good night's sleep. That's obviously one of those types of things, all the way through tools we can use to help trigger, all the way through other examples and such along those lines. So Michael Medeo came in, spoke for about an hour and a half, fielded a lot of questions, and that's going to be an ongoing relationship because in his world, there's also a behavioral aspect to that there really hasn't been any studies done. So we're going to kind of a little preview of coming attractions, but we're going to be working pretty closely with Mike to keep this relationship.
Absolutely. And his session was fantastic and eye-opening in a variety of ways, and just pitch perfect. So I know I learned a lot and got a lot out of it, and I'm sure our entire team did as well, especially as they look towards with an eye to the future in this upcoming season. Mm-hmm. I thought what we would do, Chris, is maybe just jump straight into a couple of things. I know there's been a couple of questions that we've kind of talked about recently, and that were discussed a little bit about that judge meeting. So I jotted these down and wondering if maybe you can share your thoughts with everybody in attendance, because these are definitely questions that I hear at shows frequently. I hear before critique or after critique and things like that. So I thought we'd jump in on this one first. One of the questions, one of the questions that I hear come up a lot is, how does the length of a show relate to the score earned? Does putting more show out there mean that an ensemble will automatically earn a higher score than an ensemble with a relatively shorter show? What are your thoughts on that?
Interesting. I guess it'd be difficult to give a blanket answer that would, because it's all a little more case dependent, show dependent, show dynamic dependent. Exactly how much was achieved in those in that amount of time. Group versus group. It can be a challenge to actually give a specific answer to that. There are different some captions are a little more horizontally driven, whereby the path the show is on, the musical journey, the visual journey that the show is on, there can be an unfulfillment if it just stops in certain places. Whereas in other captions, just that are a little more analytical, enough information can be garnered through that assessment that perhaps more could be rewarded there. So it's not only group to group challenging and specific, but also caption to caption. Across the 4 captions, the length may vary differently. As far as raw numerical score, the difference is just it can be a challenge for just the cumulative effort of the performers and cumulative show length to substantiate necessarily a really high composition number. It can be done extremely well, but just looking at the totality of what the responsibilities were on the performers, that may bring the score down, not bring the score down, but just not allow the score to be fully maximized just yet. If a group goes out and has 1 minute of performance done really well, it's certainly going to recognize that it's done really well, but it can be still a challenge to really substantiate perhaps even a box 5 number there, just because of the lack of cumulative volume of the show at that point.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, the answer is kind of, it's complicated, and there's not any one thing that you would factor in on this. That certainly a quantitative approach is not the right one. You can't just count up number of minutes of show and say, okay, if you have 4 or beyond, this is the minimum threshold of a score. That really the length of the show doesn't factor in as much as going through the process and evaluating each one of those considerations. Would that be a fair summary?
Fair. Sure, and it's also just looking at this in one group in isolation. If it came out with 1 minute, or if we're jumping ahead to the comparative process, that judges are going to try to assess if the group are the students experiencing, discovering, knowing, understanding, or applying skills, concepts, etc. And if you're going to juxtapose 2 groups and have to make a comparative decision, they can still do so having the groups relative, but that's where the spread guidelines would come in, and how much of a difference perhaps the shorter show is outscoring the longer show, or vice versa. We always say every number we put down is supposed to send a message to that group individually and to the groups laterally in their comparative. So in so doing, the judge would put the number down based on where that judge thought that group was on the education curve, experiencing, discovering, knowing, understanding, or applying, box 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but then also relatively with the other group. So I think there would be cases where the shorter show could outscore the longer show, and vice versa, just depending on the quality across all 4 captions, and then any timing penalty concerns and such. So right. I think there are several variables in place there that make pinpointing that exact answer challenging, but those are all variables that the judges will consider.
I'll share one little story I had from early days, many years ago when I was teaching. I foolishly, we had a certain amount of show prepared, and we performed a good chunk of it in prelims, and then at a regional for finals, we added an extra, 30 seconds or something like that. And me, my young, immature instructor brain was like, well, our score will certainly go up because we just added 30 extra seconds of show and information, all this. And of course it didn't. In finals, our score went down. And I remember talking to a colleague who happened to see us both performances that day, and I felt really frustrated about that. And he said, no, that extra 30 seconds you added made the whole thing worse. The show was better because it stopped at a natural break point and felt like there was kind of this conclusion to the arc. And then you added 30 seconds of the next idea, which was not conclusive in any way, shape, or form. And so now the whole thing works less than it did before. And that was when I kind of learned my lesson that just adding up the total number of minutes of music that we play, or the total number of sets that we perform, or something like that, is really not what the evaluation system is set up to reward. It's set up to reward achievement and complete thoughts, and to what extent did that complete thought have an effect on the audience, and all those other things. So that was really helpful for me. Unfortunately, I learned it the hard way. Chris, one of the other, I had one other question that came in after we jumped into this, and it was back on the judges meeting at the beginning of the season. The question was, is the judge clinic at the beginning of the season invitation only, or is it open to the public? Can anybody come?
There was 1 year recently, I think 2 years ago or 3 years ago, that we did open it up to outside judges. And it's also kind of region, as far as how many people came, there was probably 6 or 7 maybe. It depends on where the meeting is relative to where people live, as far as how many people come. Depending on where I know when we were still working through the 4-judge system, and it was the first time we were getting together philosophically to really allow the 4-judge system to take hold. It's not that we're doing anything secretive behind closed doors. Obviously, we just want to make sure that we're on the same page before we would put forth anything philosophically. I think this year the challenge was actually the space that we wanted to keep it. Because the roster has grown so much now, and by the time we had admin, and by the time we had the wins judges all there, we have 85, 90 people in the room, and sometimes even just flies on the wall can make the room awkward. But we are big fans of transparency, so whether it's through actually attending the meeting, or just getting a follow-up, or just emails, phone calls, etc., there's nothing discussed there that wouldn't heighten everyone's awareness. Just a question of the most efficient use of space, time, personnel, and such.
Yeah, it typically, I mean, we get so many people there at that meeting just with the WGI roster. That's a lot of bodies and a lot of voices in that room. So I know it was open one year. Typically, it's just the WGI roster that attends that meeting. But I know, that's one of the reasons that we're doing this webinar tonight, full disclosure, is because we want to be able to have a chance to chat with Chris about this stuff and be as open about the judging process and what happens at that meeting and what philosophically is shared with the team and all that stuff. So hopefully this will be a good conduit for everybody to ask those questions and to get some insight tonight.
Sure. Yeah, and if I make it, just to reinforce that point, that what we've been doing and the philosophy that WGI's had, that Mark has laid down, that Caleb continues through education, we work towards the most non-adversarial environment as possible. We understand our role in the process with regards to adjudication, providing feedback, being accountable to the scoring. WGI still binds all this into competitive structure, but we look for this to be as open and transparent and symbiotic as we can possibly make this happen.
Absolutely. Hey, Chris, we got a couple of other questions that were sent in, and they're kind of related to this first topic that we were talking about. So I'm going to share the first one with you right now. This one comes in from Jordan. The question is this: in terms of adjudication, with so much going on in a show, is it better to focus on the big picture of the ensemble and reward specific moments? Or is it more beneficial to approach it on a micro scale, addressing and fine-tuning certain details within a show, while also rewarding content/achievement? So there's a lot to unpack in that question, but as a judge, if I'm sitting down, what's my mantra? Do I want to be big picture oriented, or do I want to be detail and micro oriented? What's your thought on that?
One of the philosophies as we approach this, we always talk about just being a reflection of the performance. So we're gonna react to what's being presented as it goes. I think there are going to be different triggers through the different considerations across the four captions. Within the effect captions, we talk about macro and micro. We talk about considering the show horizontally, just that journey that we're on, going through the alphabet. And we talk about reacting to vertical moments. What happened to letter B? What happened to letter H, letter M, letter T, letter Z, etc. So it's kind of that grid structure and taking in the totality of the show within the effect. Within the more analytic captions and music and visual, it's kind of the same thing, though. They're going to react to what comes through. We always encourage the judges sometimes just take a deep breath. We're always going to let the show just wash over us and just filter our reactions through the considerations, through the criteria. So it's going to be a mix. That's probably not the answer you're going to want to hear, but it's going to be a mix of that totality and the micro based on what that moment is. We're always trying to relate the micro to the macro as we go throughout the show, so we can understand, because it is a program, capital PROGRAM.
Whenever I get a chance to talk about judging, what I always try to stress is this idea of zooming in and zooming out. I think regardless of what caption you're in, the way, at least for the WGI system, all of our sheets are set up this way, that there are attributes that you want to look at in kind of a detailed zoomed in lens, and then more holistic things that you want to zoom out and look at from a wider lens and take in the ensemble in totality. So I think as a judge, our job is never to do one or the other, it's to do both. And to have a healthy balance of both things, and to make sure that we're always speaking to each one of those considerations that's listed on the sheet.
Yeah, and at least just to not go in with either of the biases that Jordan put out there, either of the scenarios. Be prepared to, as Caleb said, to zoom in and out, just depending on what the show presents.
Excellent. Chris, kind of a related question to the first one that we were talking about show length, long versus short. Does one inherently garner more credit? Should you expect by putting more out that the score will automatically rise? This is kind of a related question, but instead of show length, we want to talk a little bit about demand and difficulty. So this question comes in from Travis. Travis wonders this: a show that is less demanding but executed well, or a show that is more demanding but not as proficient? Should groups look to the content/achievement split for evidence of either one of those impressions? Like when they're looking at those numbers between composition and performance quality, are those purely content and achievement numbers, or is there a different way groups should be looking at those two things?
Can you read just the first part of the question one more time?
Sure. A show that is less demanding but executed well, or a show that is more demanding but not as proficient? Yeah. Should groups look to the content/achievement split for evidence of either impression? I'll give my couple of thoughts on this, Chris, and then maybe you can can piggyback that.
Good.
I know that there are several other systems out there where the two boxes are content and achievement. I think the first place to start is that for the WGI sheets, we're talking music and visual. They are composition and performance quality. So it's a little bit different than just reading it as a difficulty box and an achievement box, although those are certainly aspects of both of those. I think what's really important in the indoor activity is that the word difficulty and demand isn't on any of the sheets anywhere. And what we're really looking for is not just how hard it is, but the qualitative aspects of composition. Now, that's going to include the range of content that performers are playing, but it's also qualitative considerations of orchestration and design and variety and continuity and all those other components.
Right. Yeah, piggybacking that, the definition of achievement is what and how, the combination of the two. So we're looking at it, the composition versus performance. Having a group, so again, we're looking for quality as the show goes. Hold that thought.
Sure.
Go ahead.
I think one of the important things about this question is that if you're looking at, and we'll take the effect sheets out of the mix for a second because they're structured differently. But if you look at our two analysis sheets, music and visual, they're set up truly as a what and a how. The left box is what, the right box is how. And when you get your score back, if you see 8-0 in composition and a 7-8 in performance quality, we've got the what profiled over the how by 2 percentage points. That 80 is low box 4, the 78 is high box 3. I think the question is, should we read that strictly as one number represents your content and then the other number represents your achievement of that content, or is there a different way groups should interpret those two numbers?
My brain was thinking more towards the back to the to the achievement and the difficulty. If I could follow up on the difficulty thing real quick first. When we talk about difficulty, that starts to lead more towards classification.
Yeah.
So it's not so much the layering of the challenging technical responsibilities on the groups, because that's again where it starts to delineate more of the classification. We're looking for more just the quality within each of those classes. So Caleb, can you repeat just the number relationship again? Sorry.
The thing I said or the original question?
What you were saying, sorry.
So let's say you're looking at a number and it's 80 in composition and a 78% in performance quality. One of those is low box 4 and the other one is high box 3. Should I interpret that as my content is hard? Should that be here's how hard your content was and then here is your level of achievement of said content, or is there a different way to interpret?
I think it's a fair interpretation, yeah. Such that the judges, and one of the thrusts of the judge meeting this year was looking at things on a subcaption basis. So we're looking at the composition being at an 80. The judge feels that the group at least understands the compositional concept. So that's into box 4. The performers, where they are within their responsibilities, they're on the very north end of knowing and getting close to matching where that compositional score is.
Can I ask philosophically, again, we're still in music and visual right now, what if you were to see an 80 in composition, but an 82 in performance quality? Is that possible? Does that mean that somehow your achievement now eclipses how demanding the book is? Or what should be my proper interpretation of those numbers?
I think over time there has been an interpretation of that type of scenario whereby that means that students are already perfectly playing maximizing the composition. That's not necessarily the philosophy that we're going forward with. The two numbers do have their relationship, but therein lies perhaps the show isn't complete and the performers are just doing a slightly better job at their responsibility than perhaps the compositional aspects were. So I think the 8082, I think, is the judge doing their job in profiling the subcaptions, looking at seeing where the success is, where the strengths and weaknesses are purely within the composition and purely within the performance. And then if you could see that those two numbers are still relatively close, where it would start to be awkward is if you got an 8-0 in composition and a 9-2 in performance. That type of spread would start to feel a little awkward because if the composition is only an 80, is there really even enough there to substantiate a box 5 performance number?
Yeah.
But it does go a little against historically where the philosophy's been that it's the two numbers kind of raise, and they match perfectly at the end of the season. such that composition would always outpace performance until it's done exactly perfectly. And that not necessarily always the case. A shorter show done really well, the performers are clearly trained. They're clearly doing everything that they're responsible to that point. They're doing their job, even perhaps at a mid to high box 3 number. But if it's only a minute worth of music, is there enough composition to match that high box 3? Perhaps it's a mid box 3, if that relationship makes sense.
Yep. And I think the thing I want to clarify is that left box, that composition box, is not a difficulty box. It's not a demand box. It's as qualitative as it is quantitative. And when judges are looking at those aspects of the composition, they're not just looking at how hard it is or how much has been asked of the students, although that is certainly part of the decision-making process. You're looking at truly all of those terms on the copy of the sheet. So for everybody that's tuning in tonight, if you don't already have a current copy of those sheets in your possession, they're all available on the WGI website. All you have to do is go to Percussion Resources and you'll find them. You should definitely have a copy of that. You should print those out so that when you are looking at that number, that 80 on the left box, don't think of that as my show was 80% hard. Think of it in terms of exactly what's listed, all those subcaption considerations and all those definitions, and think about strengths and weaknesses in your composition to better understand that number.
And if I make that's not to say to the core of Travis's question with the difficulty demand, that's not to say those factors aren't taken into consideration when judges are comparing groups in certain neighborhoods within the scoring process. They'll think back through everything that they assessed cumulatively, and if group A's students have more responsibilities, some more challenging responsibilities, that will weigh into part of the consideration. But when it becomes really dramatic, again, that's what starts to trigger classification. That's a different discussion.
Right. So, and the one other thing I wanted to mention on this is that we had a question. I'll kind of answer this one. John was wondering, are the left and the right boxes ranked and rated separately within the class, or should they be related to the unit? Does this differ in larger shows? The answer is they are totally ranked and rated separately. They are two independent considerations that every judge is evaluating. They are related because you're watching one show and you're trying to glean level of achievement of composition and level of achievement of performance quality. You're looking at both of those things at the same time, but they do slide differently. So there are some that think that left box number kind of pegs you for what your maximum is, and then you're just trying to get the right box to catch up to it all season. That's certainly not the way it works. In fact, at the end of the season, you may see a lot of groups where the performance quality has gone to a level far beyond the level of skill and achievement of the composition. That's a part of the process, and that's what you want judges looking for and appreciating about your groups are all the strengths and the weaknesses, not filtered through one lens only, if that makes sense.
And going back to the judge training session we had, that was the focus of the craft part of what we do, just that subcaption integrity. Really, are we really assessing all of the qualities that separate competitors when we're looking at rating and ranking those subcaptions and those considerations and those criteria on those sheets?
All right, let's see. I'm getting one additional question on this. It seems like this has struck a chord with a lot of people, so this is great. This one says, this is great. I haven't heard this kind of in-depth conversation about left and right box and how those two things are related to each other. They're wondering, hypothetically, could a show that has a mediocre design, let's say it's composition, could it get a really high performance score if it was performed nearly perfectly? What do you think about that, Chris? Is it possible to have mediocre composition, but to have performance quality through the roof?
To an extent, yes. Again, going back to what I said, if the judge goes through that impression analysis process to find the number, and if they feel like the group is at the north end of knowing, so it's high into box 3, 78 composition after they've gone through the process, but it's played really, really well, it's certainly fair again that number would go higher than the 78, but how much higher? It would be awkward, challenging to see that number, the composition, the performance number go all the way up into box 5, when what is being performed is grounded in still the no, still the KNOW, the box 3. Like, is there enough there to even substantiate a box 5 performance number? So I think you'd see those numbers a little more closely tethered, if that makes sense.
And I think that's a perfect example. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this and talking about it with some people, not in a webinar format like this. So I'm glad we can kind of touch on it tonight. When you look at the subcaption spread guidelines and you look at 8 as being significant differences, 8 and up, it would be hard. I can't imagine a show where let's say you had a 78 in composition. I can't imagine a show where you would see an 86 or above in performance quality, because if the composition has issues with it, I can't see the performance being able to eclipse it quite to that degree. I can see it 3%, 5% easily, but I'm not sure I can get all the way up to 8 and beyond, simply because there were so many deficiencies in the composition that made it hard to appreciate and see the performance quality rising to that level of achievement without composition being at a relatively higher level as well.
Right, right. And to look inside each of those subcaptions, the judges are going to go through each independently, but the how and the what and how still do exist within both. When we talk about in the composition, it's a big what and a little how. And then on the performance side, it's a little what, big how. So both still have to be considered, but they're obviously going to be delineated by the way the subcaptions are. And if we could speak to the inverse of that, because we're looking to see, the questions have been performance over composition. Flip side of that, could we see a 92 in composition and a 76 in performance? That type of spread would also be unique, because if the performance level is still grounded in that box 3, that calls into question readability. And if the performers were struggling enough that they're still there, was there enough even readable to assess a box 5 number? So that inverse relationship, just to give some insight into that relationship too. Excellent. And at some point, Caleb, whenever you want, we'll jump from the analysis captions to the effect captions to explain those side to sides.
Yeah, I was just going to jump to that, and I don't think we have to be quite as expansive here, but I think what's really important to remember is that the 2 effect sheets are not a what box on the left and a how box on the right. They are what and how mixed together. So if we were to look at effect music for a second, you'd see overall effect on the right, and you'd see music effect, on the left, and you'd see music effect on the right. So it's not going to be a what-how relationship on those sheets. So you would see the profiling there and the shift between those 2 boxes. Those would tell you very different messages than they would in an analysis caption, which is here's your what and here's your how in terms of a simplified example. The effect ones are going to be here's your what and your how in overall effectiveness, and now here's your what and your how mixed together in either your music effectiveness or your visual effectiveness. So what would you like to add to that?
Just the numbers side to side there. In the effect captions, you can see a little more of a stretch because there isn't quite that the relativity side to side, such that a group whose program connects, whose left side of the sheet, the overall effectiveness of the show triggers on all those levels. But if it's if we're in effect music, it's not necessarily because of how well the group plays or how the music was constructed. It was much more about just the overall program, how the movie was, and the soundtrack didn't necessarily relate, didn't necessarily fully deliver. So you could see a 92 in overall and an 80 in music. Just that would still be pretty extreme, because usually groups that do one well, they tend to do both. But you can see how those 2 subcaptions might be split a little more this way.
And I certainly just, anecdotally, I've seen shows before where the overall, the whole vehicle, the big program moved me moderately. I mean, it was not that effective for me, but man, the soundtrack was amazing. The art of music making was on a completely different level than the overall package, and vice versa. So I see definitive differences between those 2 captions from time to time, and would expect to see scores that kind of reflect that as well.
And again, going back to everything, every number the judge puts down sends a message. There's some insight into trying to, when you see the recap, when you see your numbers, understanding the messages that were sent.
Yeah. Well, and especially when we want the judges to look at those independently. I don't want my one number just tied to the other one. I want you to give me a true assessment of my strengths and weaknesses. If overall effect and visual effect are both strengths, I'd love to see it relatively show up that way. If one is stronger than the other, I want to see that so I know what to work on, so I know where my deficiencies are and I can make improvements.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Chris, let's change gears just a little bit now, and let's talk about commentary a little bit, and dispel one of the things that I hear people mention from time to time. I hear some instructors say that they receive pretty positive commentary. They listen to all the commentary, and good feedback, and complimentary commentary a lot of the time, but then they didn't place as well as they were hoping to place. Can you speak a little bit about that experience and that quandary that some may have?
Not the hundreds of times that does happen. Yeah. Philosophically, the whole system we have is a build-up system. So the judges are constantly looking to recognize what's being done well, what's being achieved, where the strengths are, and such. In so doing, and it's part of the process of just becoming a more mature judge, a better judge, more professional judge, still being able to balance those the awareness of what's being done well with what's perhaps suffering a little bit, just so that we talk about scoring relative commentary. So as you go through the show, you're looking at things that are positive, but also things qualifying a bit with some things where there may be some concerns. The challenge with exactly where the numbers are going to be that as the judge is doing commentary and they're doing this real-time reaction, this real-time assessing, they don't necessarily know where you're going to be placement-wise until they press stop. And then the judges go through impression, analysis, and comparison. It's a process they go through to find the number. And not until they go through the comparison phase do they know where you would be ranked necessarily. They have an idea of the rating just because of where, as they talk, these are going to ring, the comments are going to resonate in their brain. They're going to be thinking, this definitely feels like the group certainly understands the responsibilities. We're looking high end of box 4. But when it comes to the comparison, the relativity between the groups, that decision is not made to already press stop. So I may have given a lot of positive commentary that would validate a high box 4, low box 5 number because of what's being achieved well. But perhaps there's just 3 or 4 other groups that are also in that same neighborhood, also doing those things well. And just my reaction that day, my snapshot of that day, that group perhaps was the 4th of that, but it was not until after I pressed stop. So the decision I can make then is by that spread guideline, by keeping it close, I made a decision, but I didn't necessarily make a statement. So it would help reinforce the fact that I've made positive comments. There are a lot of very good, successful things happening. But at least in the snapshot today, purely competitively speaking, that group may have just been 4th of those 4.
I always try to lead with thinking about this, about the score earned rather than the placement. And this gets into some of the competitive aspects of all of this. But, let's say you had a contest and your scores went 97, 96, 95, 90, you get down to a 90. That group scored a 90, but they're going to come in last place there. They're going to be 8th. And so it would be very quick to be, frustrated. Hey, we came in last. Yeah, but you scored a 90. A 90 is an A-. You would expect a lot of positive commentary for that kind of level of achievement. Competitively speaking today, there were 8 phenomenal groups, and you ended up just, a touch below the other ones. And that's where it is today. So when you look at sometimes the ordinal and you take your commentary and compare it to the ordinal, that doesn't necessarily paint a real strong picture. It's definitely good to start with the numbers that you achieve. And even, something like an 82. An 82 is a B-. That is an above average grade if we're going with the standard grading system. You would expect to hear quite a bit of positive commentary because even if you didn't have the competitive success you were looking for, an 82 would signify that you're in box 4, and there have to be a lot of things going well for you to be in the range of a box 4. So I think that's kind of important to keep in mind, that level of expectations relative to score earned in those scenarios.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And the other thing is, I think, Chris, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think in general, the message to the judges is to look for positives and to reward those when they see them. What are your thoughts about that?
Oh, certainly, yes. But part of the challenge with that is that the judges will see and receive and assess things, but not necessarily comment on it. If that we can't comment on everything in real time. There will be things that happen that just because you didn't hear it verbalized doesn't mean it wasn't necessarily recognized. And that's a challenge. There are some judges that are just better at literally reacting to one thing but seeing the next thing, talking, and they're just, the whole time as a staff person listening to tape that they're getting all of it, but they're also still able to verbalize it, and you're just on board the whole way. That's challenging. Not all judges are able to do that. But do understand that even if the judges isn't necessarily verbalizing what's happening, they're still seeing. So even if they're perhaps saying more positive commentary than negative, they're still reacting to some things that aren't necessarily successful that day. And it's part of the craft, and it's only in doing hundreds and hundreds and thousands of tapes do judges get better at that verbalizing that real fast positive comment, but noticing what's perhaps challenging today and be able to isolate that real fast. Sometimes they'll do it in a break at the end of a first move or at the end of an introduction. They'll kind of dial back in the brain and pinpoint that type of thing for you. But it's a delicate balance, certainly.
Absolutely. A question that I got sent in was this one. Why might an ensemble's score go down from week 1 to week 2? Can you explain how that could even be possible?
Yeah, without nerding out too much on how the numbers are derived. I've said it a couple of times, but judges go through that impression, analysis, comparison. So the impression is going to put the judge in a where they are in the learning curve. Experiencing, discovering, knowing, understanding, applying. That's box 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So as the show goes on, this will go across all 4 of the captions. The judge is going to cumulatively work towards just an impression of the group. The analysis side of it is getting a little more in depth into the considerations on the sheet. So the judge's impression is that it's a box that they know, so it's a box 3. The judge is going to go right to the middle of box 3. The analysis part, they're going to start filtering more of the reactions through the considerations. All right, is it high box 3? Is it middle of box 3? Or is it low box 3? If they're the first group on, or if it's just in isolation, thinking through, okay, it's high box 3. So they'll have that high box 3 number. A judge the following week can go through that exact same process, go through that exact same impression process, go through the exact same analysis process, but just based on where box 3 is and where that upper third of box 3 is, that judge may come in 2 points below. They're both reacting the exact same way, both having the exact same thought process, but in just having to stick a number on a sheet right there, one person's a 76, the other guy it's a 74, if that makes sense. Where it would call into question is if we're talking multiple box distances. If you go from high box 4 one week to low box 3 the next week, that's worthy of a conversation and critique, and it's certainly worthy of any circuit administrator. If it were to happen at a WGI regional, our responsibility is just to kind of looking to see where that might have been. But across the thousands of groups and the tens of thousands of recordings and tens of thousands of scores and such, those types of anomalies will pop out. But by and large, I would encourage all of you to look where you are within the thirds of the boxes. So if you start to see a downward migration across many boxes, that's a concern. But if everything's kind of in high box 3, low box 4, plus or minus 2% here or there week to week, just the fact that it went down, the message could be identical from the judging community.
Yeah, I think the important thing to remember on this, the example Chris used, I think it was a 7.6, a 7.4. Those are both upper third of box 3, and so those both mean the same message. So while one seems to be 2 points lower than the other, just depending on contest dynamics and how many groups are there and where did scores start that day, the 7.6 and the 7.4 both send the same relative message. So as Chris said, being very familiar with the boxes, the thresholds for those, and then also how they break down into thirds is really beneficial for a group to understand how their score is perhaps changing over time. Related question, Chris. A person sent this in and said that they go to a lot of local competitions and they usually go to one WGI regional a year. And it seems like every single year they'll go to a local competition. The next week they'll go to a WGI regional and their score will go down at that regional every year. Can you talk a little bit about why that might happen?
I guess it's understandable that it could and has happened. I think that, like with a lot of things, there would be several variables, depending, not knowing who judged or not knowing the national perspective of the judge that perhaps saw them on the local level, to understand where a national barometer would be for a high box 3 number, high box 4 number. I think that's probably the most telling. Also, that it could be a challenge just with the number of groups, and just again within the contest dynamic, that at a local show there might only be 3 groups, so the judge can very comfortably low box 4 or 83. But then when you get to a regional, there's 15 groups that are at 83. And we certainly encourage judges to avoid ties. We try to keep the rating as appropriate as possible. But unfortunately, sometimes just the contest dynamic will skew that cluster of groups and perhaps push a number lower than it was week to week. I think those are probably the 2 most prevalent reasons why that would happen.
Awesome. Thank you. Chris, let's change gears for a couple minutes. Let's talk about critique just a little bit. I've got a couple of questions here, and then I know we have a couple of people that have asked them recently. So at the end of a contest at most of the WGI regionals, whenever we can, we always try to offer a critique after prelims. And that time is really for the instructors and the directors of the group to spend a little bit of time with judges. And we always want that time to belong to the instructors, which means the most important thing is, as an instructor, that you come in with a game plan. How do you want to use those 3 minutes? What kinds of things do you want to ask the judge about? What do you want to share with them? What would be the most productive use of your time? But I know a lot of young instructors, it can be intimidating when you walk in there for the first time. It's 3 minutes. You're not really sure what to do with all of it. And it seems to go by in a flash. So I'm wondering if you can share and shed a little bit of light on a couple of critique questions for us. The first one I have for this, for you, Chris, is this one. Is a group allowed to talk about their numbers, either their score or their placement in critique? What do you think?
As again, part of our philosophy, it falls under accountability. WGI has chosen competition as a means of bringing all this together. So as much as we're part of the process and we try to help the construction of the show and act as almost as an extra consultant, eventually we have to make a competitive decision. We have to find those numbers. We talked briefly about the process, how the judges do find those numbers and such. But once that decision has been made, the group is going to see that. And we talked about every number the judge puts down sends a message. So as a staff member, I interpreted that message. I don't know if I agree with that message. There needs to be a platform and a place for me to talk about that. This may go against where, in times gone by, it was perhaps a little more taboo because it was a little more confrontational. I would encourage those who do want to talk about numbers, and we encourage the judges to preface this. That may not be the best use of the 3 minutes. As Caleb said, this is really about the staff and what they can do to make their performance more maximized, make the performance better and such. But if all of that is satisfied and you're really just looking for some insight into relativity, we are encouraging the judges to be comfortable with that. Understanding that in the heat of the moment, certainly at a large regional, it can automatically feel a little awkward and controversial and such. But it should be a little more relaxed. So allow both sides to take a deep breath, and we can have this conversation about your number alone, but also your number compared to your groups. And we can have that conversation. So whatever questions you might have, if you thought your score was too high, why did it go down? Your number versus other groups, there's a lot of other questions kind of embedded within that, Caleb, as far as where that exact critique scenario may be. But it's not necessarily the best use of time, again, but we are encouraging the judges to be more comfortable with it. Some will be more comfortable than others, for sure. But it may take a deep breath to go back through. It's really hard to recreate in that exact moment right there within 25 A-class groups, the decision I made after the 18th one, why it was an 84.5. All right, just give me 20 seconds and all right, I'm good to go. But there we just burned like 2.5 minutes of critique just trying to settle in on that. It's really hard to boom, 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 exact ordinal placements and such. But we do encourage everyone to be welcome into that discussion.
Absolutely. I have found for myself, when I was teaching, I would sometimes have that conversation and talk about numbers. Sometimes I was happy, sometimes I was not so happy. And then every one of those critiques I left, I realized I didn't get a whole lot out of those conversations most of the time because that number is there and it's gone and it doesn't matter towards the future. Asking really good questions of the judges were far more valuable to me. So on that note, we have a question from Tim. Tim is wondering if you could perhaps share, Chris, what would be some good questions to ask a judge in critique that would help their group? And I'll give you a chance to kind of think about this for a second.
Yeah, sorry.
But yeah, in general, what would perhaps be some good questions? While Chris thinks about that, the first thing I want to mention is that you should definitely listen to all of your commentary before critique. I think at this point, everybody knows that, but make every effort possible to listen to that. It's really hard to come in with good questions for a judge if you haven't already heard them working through your show and giving you feedback in real time. So that cannot be overstated how important listening to the commentary is. And then really coming in with some notes prepared ahead of time. Write out your questions by hand, maybe on the back of an envelope or something like that, one for each one of the judges that you're going to talk to so that you're organized, you've kind of got a game plan of how you want to spend those 3 minutes, and you're prepared to maximize that time. So, Chris, with that being said, what are some of the questions that you would encourage people to ask during that time?
Yeah, pretty blue sky, kind of just blue skying it from there. Given the 4 separate caption considerations that'd be stuff to unpack within each of those. Again, understanding how the judges go, they're always looking for what the impression is as the show goes on. We talk about judging through time, judging over time. We even added it to the sheets now. So one question might be what was your, as a judge, what was your impression of the show? What may have as the show went on, what may have changed your impression of the show? So specifically, was it in the more analytical captions, is it how well the performers, is the training evident? These are genuine questions asked. Is it obvious that they're being trained? Does it seem like what's being written for them is compatible? Does it seem like something that they'll be able to maximize? When it comes to just more of the programmatic side, does the show have an identity? Was the show memorable? And I know you judged like 18 groups today. Thinking back to my show at Blue Central High School, how memorable, how much of an identity did my show have in and amongst the other ones you saw? Do you remember me, Blue Central High School? I was on at 9:30 this morning.
Right.
Okay, we'll work on that. So it's those types of considerations. The bigger picture, because specifically within a critique setting, the judge is going to have notes, and the judges have fantastic tools nowadays as far as taking pictures, any kind of memory joggers, triggers. But looking more macro, will get them the faster, most effective answer, I think, just because of the time frame. As you see a judge more and more throughout the season, if it's a judge you know very well and you can already have a candid conversation with them, you can just go, boom, let's talk about the quad line, blah, blah, and you can dig a little more deeply into that moment. But any more macro, anything that'll help you stand out from a competitive identity, programmatic identity throughout the show can go a long way.
That's great advice. Everybody that's watching, rewind this part, listen to it again, because those are some great conversation starters for you to dive into and things that I think will be really beneficial for your group going forward. Kind of a follow-up question to that, Chris. What are some things that judges would like to hear from ensembles about their group in critique? Like, you're a judge, you're sitting in the chair, critique's about to begin. What are you hoping the group will discuss or bring up or mention during your time together?
I think that there is a plan, that they've already, I mean, they would have seen the show all week long, and they would have seen the manifest obviously that day, Saturday, but just that they're doing their own level of self-assessment. This depends on, not to open up more, but across the different paradigms, the judges are going to have different responsibilities in talking to the group. So if this is an A-class critique, if it's an open class critique, if it's a world-class critique, the conversation could be slightly different. But in general, we'd like to hear groups come in, staffs come in, already having kind of their own assessment list, and at times they're just looking for the judges to kind of affirm or confirm some of the suspicions they may have already had. But just knowing that there's a plan, knowing that there's a production schedule, knowing that you guys are on a trajectory is very comforting for the judge. It just makes us feel more part of the process, because you're a moving train, and we just saw you that day. And we did what we could as a consultant for the 7 minutes we saw you. We're going to be your biggest fan for this. But just knowing that there's forward momentum is exciting. It makes us excited to see you again.
Chris, do you feel like in that moment you want them to explain their show concept to you? Is that something you're looking for as a judge?
It can be challenging because there's no guarantee that we would see them again. So as far as bouncing ideas and just kind of, if they're just looking, there's a minute left of the show, this is kind of where the storyboard is. If we continue on this arc, would this make sense? I think those are fair questions along those lines.
What about, it's early season. You just saw about 2/3 of the show. They've got two movements out there. There's still a closer to come. Do you want to know what's coming in the closer as a judge? Are you curious about that in critique? Do you want them to share that? Do you not want them to share that? What are you thinking?
I guess I'll leave that to them. It's exciting. It's fun to be surprised, but just the fact that they have conviction that there's a plan, I think goes a long way, just to that comfort level. Yeah.
I think for me, what I'm always looking for, I'm an educator, and so I'm big on reflection. And I think when critique can be a chance for me as a judge to reflect on the job I did for you, I hope it was a really good job. I hope it was beneficial. But I want to reflect because I'm trying to get better at this. And I think when a group comes in and they are genuinely reflective about where they are as an ensemble, where their show is right now, where their students are, that always seems to be the best conduit for great conversations. Yep. So I think as you're preparing for critique, one of the best things you can do is to take a reflective approach and question everything about what you're doing. Question what you thought was working that maybe didn't seem to work as well today. Just be open-minded about that stuff, and that allows critique, I think, to be the most beneficial time.
I know I've used many times. I say that you know your kids way better than we do, as far as where they are on their learning curve, where your rehearsal schedule is. Did you front load things? Do you still have 4 entire weekends of rehearsal schedule? And just being honest. Again, I feel I've used self-assessment. Just being honest with where the path that you're on with the kids. Knowing the better, knowing how they are third period, knowing how much exposure you have to them. and being realistic in the goals as we go, because the judges love being part of that process, to be honest. So that trust factor and that comfort factor, knowing that there is that self-assessment going on. Ultimately, this is truly about the students and what they're, so it comes down to compatibility. Is the training in place? Are you doing enough to support the concept so that they understand it? And going forward there, yeah.
Excellent. John asked a question, and John, I just want to recap it really quick. I think Chris and I covered this pretty well in the earlier part of the broadcast, so if you were tuning in late, maybe you can catch a recorded copy. John was wondering, at early regionals, how do panels evaluate incomplete productions? First note to the last note, maybe not filled in, versus half of the program completely detailed, considering great performances from both. I don't think there's a pat answer for that, John, where you go, okay, first note to last note not filled in is always greater than half program completely detailed. I think, again, one of the things we ask judges to do is to evaluate what is presented today with all of its strengths and weaknesses, and then to filter it through the criteria on the sheet. So individually analyze whatever caption you are, analyze each one of the considerations in the subcaption, and ask yourself, to what extent did they achieve blank, and fill in that blank word. It may be sometimes that the first note to last note not filled in was a greater level of achievement today because the thought was complete, and the detailing will further enhance it later on down the road, but there was enough here that it really worked. It may be other times that one just felt too thin and too Spartan, and instead the half program completely detailed in. While it's not a complete thought yet, there's a level of detail and craft and precision and care infused into that's a higher level of achievement right now. So it's kind of a mixed bag when you have incomplete productions early season. Any additional thoughts to add on that one?
Yeah, I think what we didn't actually done, what we talked about earlier, just as far as the judge's assessment of that show, they're just taking a snapshot of that show that day. So in comparing those two groups based on how much is done, it's still just a reaction that day. It's not a projection of where things will be at circuit championships or all the way through to WGI. It's just a reaction that day. So it's the judge is going to make that call where you are on your learning curve based on the length of the show and how well it's done, and then also just relatively within the spread guidelines. It's just a snapshot of that day.
Chris, I want to change gears and talk about classification a little bit. And I want to mention tonight, we're not going to do a deep dive on classification, but we do have a couple of things we'll be sharing with the community early this season. But as it pertains to adjudication, I think there's a couple of important things that I kind of wanted to touch on with you, Chris. Chris, does a high score early in the season automatically mean that an ensemble is going to be reclassified?
It would not automatically mean, no. There would be conversations stemming from that based on the judge's evaluation that day and such. But there's a chance that group is correctly classified, perfectly correctly classified. They just front-loaded their rehearsals, and they're maximizing what those performers can do at that level, at that paradigm, within those skill sets. That'd be a little bit of a case-by-case basis then, just to see kind of where that would be. If they're doing things that successfully to trigger that type of number, there may be things certainly in place that would warrant a change of classification. But there's no automatic trigger. There's no number trigger. We've had shows where the third place group was actually the one reclassified, just because the performers are clearly more mature. They're clearly handling different skill sets. But just across all four captions that day, other people's shows made more sense, so they actually scored better. But clearly, the skill sets of the third or fourth place group warrant more a different language, different feedback from the judges.
And likewise, earning a low score doesn't mean that you're misclassified and need to move down to the next class. It just may be, in that paradigm, this is your current level of achievement. That doesn't mean you're in need of a different paradigm. It just means there's still growth and development to do in the paradigm that you are. I think the point I want to make is that we as an activity try to separate score earned from class of best fit as much as possible, because our classes do not graduate based on score. They graduate based on the skills and abilities and maturity of the ensemble as they move through our activity. So a 90 at the first show out in A class doesn't mean you are definitely an intermediate ensemble. It may mean that you're maximizing basic skills and that you're a 90 there, and by the end of the season, you're a 92. That may be the arc of the group, because as Chris said, they just came out very well prepared. At the same time, you may see a group that comes out not well prepared at the beginning of the season, earns a relatively low score, and then does all sorts of growth and development over the course of the season, and is just maximizing things at the end. So don't think that the score and the classification necessarily have anything to do with one another. All right, Chris, I'm going to toss the softball up here for you because I think I know your feelings on this. I know my feelings, but I do get this question a whole lot every year. How important is it that groups compete in the right class?
It's like circuit to.
Yeah.
I touched on it briefly before, but across the three paradigms, the judges are going to wear different hats. They have different roles. It's A class, open class, world class. It's teacher, counselor, critic. So they're different pedagogical, different educational language that's going to be used with each, just to best target, just to deliver the best information that those groups need along that curve. So if you have a group that's competing locally in one class, they're going to get a certain level of language and feedback and role responsibility by the judges. Then if they go to regional in a different class, it's literally a paradigm shift of the judge's role in that process. So that it can really be detrimental to the group's development, almost getting mixed signals. There's different expectations for the different paradigms. So classically what we see is a group will compete in open locally and then perhaps go to A at a regional. I think this has been pretty well normalized, if I'm not mistaken, Caleb, that everyone seems to be pretty well, they do locally what they do nationally. At least it's better than it was in the past. But that group that competes open locally, and then the national judge comes through to see that, they're going to see that as open. They're going to trigger counselor mode, and they're going to look at that group compared to all the other opens they've seen around the country, and that group's number could be dramatically lower than what they're used to getting, because the expectations are going to be to that open class. And then when they go to A class, it'll be basic, and this is a whole different change of message. So we look for consistency. The philosophy behind it, it's not an exact science. Arriving at a number is not an exact science. Classification is not an exact science. But the more we can have consistency to the approach, starting with just being in the most appropriate paradigm, most appropriate class, can go a long way to getting consistent commentary, consistent growth, consistent feedback.
I definitely think our system is set up to not be a grouping of competitors, but to instead be a grouping of skill sets. So I think if Ensemble A has intermediate skill sets, that's the class they should compete in all season, locally, regionally, world championships, what have you. I wouldn't advise that group compete in the advanced paradigm locally, even if they're 5 points better than all the other intermediate groups. You want feedback and you want evaluation tied to the skill and ability of your ensemble. So the quicker groups can get themselves in the right class, the more successful it is. Chris, while we're on the subject, I just wanted to bring this up really quick. I sometimes hear from groups that are approached about a reclassification. And the first thing they say will be something like, yeah, we were thinking we were in the wrong class. We just wanted to start here and then wait for you to, reclassify us at a regional or something like that. What are your thoughts on that in terms of a strategy and an educational approach to the season?
My thoughts are that it definitely does happen a lot. The challenge with that is, again, what I said before, you're wasting several weekends of the most appropriate read and most appropriate relative feedback, because it could go 3 or 4 before you get to that first regional where anybody nationally would get that perspective, unless you have some national people come through and such. Most circuits, based on the education work Caleb's doing and how everything filters down through the circuits, the awareness of what's what classification-wise is getting better and better. So I think the circuits are doing a much better job of getting that in place. But I would encourage any group that was thinking about that, either try to send a shot across the bow before the season with a video, or just get some type of heads up or guidance with where someone else may think it is, as opposed to just rolling it out and just wondering and waiting for that reclassification, because you may have just stalled a month's worth of fantastic information that would have come in that appropriate class.
And I think that's the biggest thing for me. The activity is thriving right now. There's no doubt about that. But I think to the extent our activity continues to thrive, it'll be based on people getting themselves in the right class as quickly as possible and then trying to thrive in that paradigm. As Chris said, waiting to be reclassified if you have a feel like you should be in a different paradigm really robs yourself of several weeks of getting high quality information back from adjudicators tied to the specific paradigm that matches to your program and to your students and their maturity and all that other kind of stuff. So the sooner sooner groups can self-classify in the right location, the better. And to the extent that anybody is truly not sure about that, you're always welcome to send in a video to myself or Chris or Mark, and get a little bit of non-binding feedback. But we can always, kind of nudge you in the right direction if you are curious about that stuff. So I'm hoping a lot of groups, we've taken huge strides as an activity in the last couple of years to self-identify class of best fit, and I'm hoping we can keep that going and come out of the gates with 98% of everything in the right spot at the beginning of this year. There will always be groups on the bubble. There will always be questions. It is a sliding scale between A and open. It changes as the activity evolves. So it's never going to be perfect, but by and large, I think we're moving in a positive direction there. Chris, kind of a related question, but specific to judging through the different paradigms. Jillian sent this one, and it's kind of long, so I'll read it to you in little pieces. Is there a specific criteria that judges follow that determines whether or not content is basic or intermediate when judges are differentiating between A and open class skills? So that's the first part, is there specific criteria that the judges follow to figure out if the content is basic or intermediate? Mm-hmm. And here's the second part of it. Is that up to judges' discretion, or is it something that's etched in stone? How can this person maximize credit when their players might achieve a passage of higher level technical ability that is arguably a class above what they're currently in? Mm-hmm. So there's a lot to unpack in that one as well. But I think we'll take the first part first. Is there a specific criteria that judges follow that determines whether or not content is basic or intermediate when they're differentiating between A and open class skills?
Not a specific criteria. And again, it also, looking at across the four captions, it depends on where that's triggered. I guess if the question is specific just to the analysis captions or to the effect or to, because certainly some groups are clearly physically trained, visually trained stronger, but perhaps the curriculum and the approach to music isn't necessarily. So there's that difference in all types of considerations or criteria within the visual versus the music. Also just within the maturity of the program and the concepts of the program and the performer's ability to understand the program when it comes to the effect side of things. So it's not etched in stone. I would say it's just a cumulative, because the percussion division has been around so long, it's been populated by so many groups, and we see so many hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of performances all year. That delineation between A, open, and world has become a little more clear than others. There's always going to be a little bit of an overlap with regards to some groups that want to maximize A. They will start to dabble a little bit into some of the intermediate concepts and such. We certainly encourage that this all to be done well. Obviously, it's not just that they're playing an advanced or an intermediate concept; it's supposed to be done well and such. And it may only be one segment of the ensemble that does. We've seen that where there's three clearly intermediate marimbas. The rest of the upfront ensemble is clearly A class. So you're not going to hold those three marimba players back necessarily. You're still going to give them responsibilities that are married to where they are in their training and such. But that wouldn't necessarily be enough to elevate the entire ensemble into the next class. So it's not something that's etched in stone. It's just a cumulative reaction.
And I think it's important to remember that judges, when they're in that seat and they're working a show and they're evaluating the performances, they're not doing classification there. They're not there deciding who's basic and who's intermediate. They sit down and they say, okay, Percussion Scholastic Open is starting. I'm going to put on my open class paradigm mindset. I'm going to grab my intermediate expectations. And now I'm expecting to see a lot of groups showing me intermediate things, and I'm going to react and respond to that. When I was judging Percussion Scholastic A earlier in the day, I put on my basic skills mindset, and I was expecting those kinds of things to be performed. So judges are not the ones that are doing the classification. That's usually done hopefully by the group and a real clear self-assessment of where the strengths and weaknesses are of the group and what kind of feedback and expectations they need applied. And then when need be, done by a classification committee or a team of administrators for a circuit or for WGI or something like that to weigh in on all of those things. Right. I think in terms of the last part of it, sorry, Chris, go ahead.
Sorry, just with that, I think they're, no, go ahead, Caleb. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, in terms of the last part, like how can I maximize credit when my players achieve a passage at a new technical level? I would encourage you to not think about, trying to take like our open class moment in the show and get as much credit as possible. I would really encourage you to write a show based on what your students are capable of, and then try to maximize the whole entire thing. If the snares are ready for a lot of intermediate content, but you know the tenors and the basses aren't, then don't hold back on the snares and don't overwrite for the tenors and the bass drums. Write for the students you have, help them maximize what their capabilities are on their instruments, and then we'll kind of let the classification chips fall where they may. To the extent that the judge is evaluating it, they're going to be looking at the show through time. So they're going to read that, man, we seem to have a really strong snare section. And so as I'm looking at some of these attributes musically and visually, I can credit a lot of the achievement of what the snares are bringing to the table. Next steps for the ensemble are to continue to work on some of the deficiencies in some of the other sections, because everything is varied and is not painted with that one brush. So write for the group you have, and then just try to maximize the whole entire show rather than the open class part of the show or hanging your hat on that one moment in the show. Make everything tailored to your students and then maximize that.
Right. And in feeling the need to give those intermediate responsibilities, the judges are still going to look and see just compatibility. If more and more of segments of the ensemble are attempting intermediate skills and doing them well, that's going to start to trigger classification considerations. If you're just trying to give the responsibilities just to kind of lead them and give them more challenges, but they're not achieving it, you'll start hearing comments like kind of question the compatibility. It doesn't seem like the training's in place for the performers. They may have more responsibility than they need to have in this class. So it's just that delicate balance of where the training has led them to, what the writing is compatible, and then how well they're able to perform it that day.
All right, a couple other quick ones kind of related that I'm going to check off really quick. Got one question from Grant that said, do you feel circuits should align classification with WGI? Should circuits be doing this with their rule book rather than letting ensembles decide? Absolutely. I think it starts by talking to your ensembles and saying, hey, if you compete in open at the WGI regional, that's the class you should be in for our local circuit as well. I know some of the most successful circuits in the country have gone to a strict alignment between WGI and their local circuit classification. I really do think that helps groups thrive. So absolutely there. And then an additional question kind of about classification at regionals. This one was a group hypothetically went to a regional. No judge said, hey, you're in the wrong class. And then they found out a couple weeks later that they were going to be reclassified. And so it was wondering about the role of the regional panel in the classification process. Do they have a role in that process? I'll kind of tackle this one, and then Chris, maybe you can jump in with any of those other thoughts. The panel that's working that regional, their job is to evaluate the groups that are performing and tie that to the considerations on the sheet. They're not there looking at classification that weekend. So it wouldn't be uncommon to not hear anything from that panel because they're truly talking about the show and maximizing strengths and minimizing weaknesses. We usually leave the classification decisions up to a committee or to an administrative panel or a steering committee or something like that to handle those kinds of things. Now, that being said, if a judge in their caption is looking at your performance and says, well, we'll just grab effect visual for a second. In the effect visual caption, I'm seeing a whole lot of things here that are more consistent with the next paradigm up. That is something that you might hear in your recorded commentary. It's certainly something you might hear in critique, and certainly something you could bring up in critique if you as a group had some questions or had some concerns. You could solicit and seek some of that feedback if you'd like to do so. Chris, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, pretty much as Caleb said, the judges are going to be reacting that day. And just also understanding that, like with half of the score, if you're looking specifically, the score didn't necessarily dictate, and the judges didn't trigger anything. Half of the score is the effect. An effect can transcend class, so they may not be anything that necessarily triggers a classification consideration within that. And then within the music and the visual, again, just within the maturity of the performers and the skill sets that are being presented. There may be a struggle. The judges may be reacting to achievement-based struggles that day, and not necessarily having to read all the way through to the inherent maturity of the performers, and where that might be a month from now.
Awesome. We'll spend some more time talking about classification down the road. There'll certainly be some materials that we're publishing this year that we want to share with the community at large. So we're going to kind of change gears up for this, but all the the adjudication, relative questions to adjudication, I thought were, or relative to classification, I thought were great tonight. Chris, let's talk about a couple of nuts and bolts things really quick, because I know we have some judges that are tuning in online tonight. I also know that we have some aspiring judges, or maybe even some instructors that would someday like to become a judge. Can you talk to us a little bit about how somebody becomes a WGI percussion judge?
Specifically on the roster working for WGI, or just getting
like let's say let's say I wanted to join the WGI roster. What does that process look like?
Sure. Ideally, you would have been judging somewhere just to go to get that part of the craft down. Most, if not all, judges have gone to that classic progression. They were a performer when they were younger. They taught. They started to design. Maybe they started to coordinate, and now they're ready to kind of tie all that together and turn it around on the other side. And be able to get feedback and such. So for judges that are looking to just make that leap, for instructors who are looking to make that leap to potentially get onto the WGI roster, it's just getting out there and doing it. There's a fantastic network of circuit partners and circuits all over the country. So depending on where your region is, it's certainly knowing the philosophy, knowing the manual and such, but just getting out there, judging enough that you're on the radar, so that we can start to evaluate you at the circuit level, because a lot of the groups are the groups that we see nationally anyway. So it's it's a good training ground as far as getting good exposure, getting good to get a feel for where the judges are. Specifically jumping on the WGI roster, it's often as a function of where the roster needs are, because there really aren't that many regionals if you really look at it, count at it. There's only 4 captions, and we kind of operate with a pretty lean and mean roster, we call it, such that we pretty much carry is the exact number of judges we need to satisfy Thursday of World Championships. And for the last couple of years, it's been exactly 8 in each caption. So you're only looking at that few, 12 in each caption to get across there. So it's to bring that many more judges onto the roster, it just dilutes the exposure. Most judges only have 2 regionals as it is. So if we increase it that much more, there'd be that fewer regional exposure as it is. So ideally, it's just getting, if you're a current working judge looking to be considered for WGI, it's just getting out there and working in as many circuits as possible. We talk about it really getting that trust factor, so that by the time you've worked in 5 or 6 different circuits and you've developed a relationship with those circuits, you've developed a trust factor. They know your professionalism, they know you know the craft. That when there is an opening and we start to look at the most narrow candidates that are being considered, that person is on that radar very, very easily. It's more of a natural extension for them to join the roster as opposed to just from somewhere.
So definitely, if I wanted to someday join the ranks of the WGI roster, there'd be a lot of work that I'd have to do to get to that point. Can you tell us, if somebody's listening tonight, maybe they're a current instructor, but they would like to get into judging, they're not sure where that path will take them someday, but they'd at least like to get started. What would be a good first step for somebody to take that wants to get into adjudication?
The very first one is to get the hands on the manual and read it cover to cover. It's a tremendous resource. We spent a lot of time over the last couple of years really streamlining it, going from macro to micro and really breaking it down. It's not exactly how to judge, but it definitely gets into the brain, all of the philosophy, all the accountability, all of the sheets, understanding all that starts to hint to where the craft is. And then obviously now where we are with the program that Caleb's running with the Certify. Levels 1 and 2 go right through all of the most macro philosophy points and such. But getting all that, because if you're an instructor, that's been your perspective. Now flipping it around and being able to take the assessment and understanding how to arrive at a number and understanding those considerations, how to prepare for critique as on the judge side, how to make a decision on group 17 in Scholastic A when there's still 8 more to go. You have 25 on the same sheet. And then it's just doing it. Just get out there, start running tapes. Everybody is near enough to a local circuit where if you just have to give up a Saturday, we all did it back in the day. You drive somewhere, you sit, and you just make 6 hours of tapes. And just to get that verbalization going, just to get that feel for the dynamic of a show, for the dynamic of a contest, for the endurance of a contest, for putting numbers down, making decisions. Everybody loves to make commentary because as instructors, you make tapes. You just make tapes of your group. But then you press stop, and you have 7 seconds to put a number down before Brad Bell's voice comes back on and next group's ready to go. So it's that speed factor. So it's really just getting out, like any craft, just getting out and doing it. And then eventually getting to a point where you're looking for more of a mentor be it at a circuit level, be it more at a national level, just somebody to take a listen, kind of a drop the needle approach to see kind of where the tone is, where the understanding of the caption is.
Great. On that note, we had a couple of people just type in some questions that were asking a little bit more about the WGI Certify process. WGI Certify for Color Guard launched a couple of seasons ago, and it's run through the eAdjudicate Academy. So if you do a web search for WGI Certify, you'll now find, if you go to that website, that we have just in the last couple of months launched it for percussion as well. So we haven't historically had a great answer for this question of what's a good first step. We now have it. So we've got a couple of online courses that you could take. Level 100 is live now. Level 200 is on the horizon. And that would be a great place to get started. It's some online classes that'll kind of walk you through some of the basics and some of the details for getting started. So definitely look into that. Again, you can just Google WGI Certify, and it's all run through eAdjudicate. So that's what you're looking for when you start to set out and look for those things. Chris, let's talk a little bit about the current roster. You mentioned that we've got 12 for each caption, and that's the whole entire WGI roster. Is that correct?
Yes. Oh, no. This year we did add 3 this year. We're up to 51 active roster active on the roster right now across the 4 captions. Plus, I think we're up to 22 TMP. Yeah.
Can you tell us how many new judges are joining the WGI roster this year?
3 new this year, and then 2 that had been on the roster in years past. They had to take last year off and are back on now.
Excellent. Great. I had a question that was sent in that asked this, and I think you kind of already touched on it, but maybe you can recap the answer. How do you decide which judges on the roster will be judging at World Championships each year?
Depending on the class and depending on the day, as I mentioned, we because of the workload on Thursday at World Championships, because of just the sheer saturation of all the classes, all the different venues, we needed that many panels. We needed everybody that was on the roster to be working that day. We always effort to have the same panel do a prelims and a finals, semifinals and finals, from a Thursday, Friday within the Opens and the Worlds, and ideally as much as possible with the A's and such. So given that makeup of the roster, given what they judged last year, we try to not have people do the same caption, same class year to year. And then within each of the captions, everyone's aware that it's obviously double paneled. So just the way there's a chemistry and a pairing of the judges within all those double panels, there's a thought process to all that. There's a strategy to all that to best maximize the global scope of how those 8 judges are going to take in the show. So as far as there'll be someone who's from the active roster. It'll change from year to year, and we've just settled into this new mode. We're only we're still pretty new to the 4-judge system, so it's only been a couple years now where we've worked in all 4, having to work it through all 4 captions and such. But we do like to rotate it so you're not judging the same caption year to year, and then the pairing of you with a different judge within the double panels there's also a whole process behind all that.
All right, couple other questions for you. While we're talking about World Championships, can you tell us, Chris, what you think the most difficult part of judging World Championships is?
Most difficult, or I guess difficult and exhausting, maybe the same. The workload of the weekend is challenging. Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Obviously, it's the highest stakes. Obviously, it's pressure. It's been a long journey, and we certainly encourage the judges to try to be as throughout the season. Nobody can put in as much time as the groups do, obviously, but to come in with as much preparation, to spend as much time preparing as possible, so when you get there, you're ready to go. I think most challenging is in the larger classes and maintaining the highest level of professionalism, the highest level of integrity all the way through the entire class. So not just worrying about, I just got to get the top 3 right. I want to make sure that 15, 16, 17 are exactly what, in my mind, that day, 15, 16, 17 were. So it's being able to maintain that. So that just what that does for the focus throughout the entire block, the entire class. When it gets to finals, when you're into 15, I want to make sure that the decision I make between 11, 12, and 13, that I care as much about that as I did 1, 2, and 3. And that can be a challenge. It's as the show goes on, really making sure that everything is of the highest level of integrity. It can be challenging.
Definitely, no doubt about it. We had a follow-up question to one thing you mentioned just a minute ago. John was wondering, he says he's a local circuit judging coordinator, and he was wondering if you could explain a little bit more what you meant related to chemistry in double panel selections. When you're putting together a double panel, talk maybe a little bit more about what you're looking for in terms of chemistry.
Without going into just the personalities, we encourage all the judges to bring their perspective, their own personal perspectives, their own life experiences, their own what roles they've had in other areas of the arts, where they are as doctors, doctoral professors at colleges, what they bring. So if we know, it can be as simple as looking at it from the music perspective. All of the music judges understand the breadth of all the responsibilities within the percussion ensemble, but it's fair to say some come from a stronger front ensemble background, some come from a stronger battery background. As much as we do crossbreed and work through the training of both, and there's heightened awareness and everything we can do to make sure that everybody is first, there's going to be some different biases and strengths. So we would ideally, the most simple example would be pairing those two together. And some of the effect captions, somebody who's done a ton of programming, super macro, big picture producer versus someone who still does perhaps a little more of the nuts and bolts. Just marry those two together, so we're getting almost a three-dimensional view of the show through those two judges, through those two lenses, and projecting it across that way. Yeah.
On that note, I think it's kind of related, but we had one question that was sent in that was wondering about, in those double panel situations, was wondering about variance. Extreme discrepancies between two judges. They're judging the exact same caption, but they're reading the show very differently. And so ordinals may be very different, scores may be very different. Talk to us a little bit about that, Chris.
Just that it does happen, obviously. We lead all this by saying that it's never an exact science, but we still look for a consistent application of everything we do. We do encourage judges to bring their experiences, their collective human experiences to the table. So sometimes a judge can get caught where they're seduced by something, and it can spin them into a little bit like a euphoric high, and then everything that just triggered it. It was 30 seconds of the show, and that just launched them this way. Or it could trigger something into a downward spiral where it affected them so negatively that it started to kind of bleed out into other things that are happening in the show. Ideally, this doesn't happen, obviously, and when it does happen, it's still very, very rare, but it's just part of the human nature of having 8 humans subjectively reacting to what's going on in the show. It does happen. It's, from an exposure standpoint, it's also challenging for the judges because everybody sees that. Everybody's immediately, to be honest, everybody looks immediately at the ordinals, and you want to see somebody had me second, somebody had me 10th. How does that happen? I would encourage, as Caleb and I have talked a little bit about, really reading into the numbers. Was it second and 10th by just a little bit, or were you all still in the bottom box 5? That's the way the ordinals shook out. It's just how each of those judges reacted to those two performances that day. When it does become that skewed, we do encourage the judges just to self-reflect. If it's really extreme, we kind of have a little bit of an admin reflection, but we never have the judges, we never enforce the judges or dictate to them a different decision must be made. We still need to trust that they'll take a deep breath, we'll get another view on it and such. It's just one of those conundrums that does unfortunately pop up within the activity. But again, when you look at as many hundreds and hundreds of groups as are and thousands of comparative scores that are made, it doesn't happen all that often. But it's just part of the process. Yeah.
It's kind of remarkable considering how many numbers are written down at any event, and especially if you start to think about world championships. It's kind of remarkable how close and how similar and how on the same page, for lack of a better word, things tend to shake out. And as Chris said, it is extreme rarity that we would see those major discrepancies, but they do happen from time to time. I'll just give one personal anecdote because this is one of my favorite stories to tell. The first year I had a group in world class ever. We went to world championships, and after prelims, 2 judges, same caption. One had us first and the other one had us 14th. And this was when there was only prelims and there was only finals. That was it. So there was no semifinals. So you look at that and it's eye-opening because you go, this person says world champions, and this other person says you're not good enough to make finals because we only took 12 finalists at the time. And it's really hard to wrap your brain around. As I started to kind of zoom out and think about it a little bit more, we were neither destined to be world champions, nor should we have been a non-finalist. We probably should have been around the 7-8 spot. And so when you take that first and you take that 14th and you average those things out, it really does turn into the relative rank that group should have. So I think it's always important to look at all of those numbers as showing some of the messy work of the math problem behind the scenes, and then really focusing in on the final bold number at the end of that column. Because all of those numbers, all of those spreads, it's a careful dance and a careful science to try to get the overall outcome correct at the end of the day. And I think Chris's approach of trying to put two people on a panel that we know are going to bring two different backgrounds and two different perspectives to that caption, while it may not make recaps always look really nice, it does work to the group's advantage, because what you do is you start to average out all those discrepancies over the course of a contest, and hopefully all the groups wind up in the right relative location once the whole thing's done. Mm-hmm. Chris, I think we're going to bring this to a close for tonight with one final question, and this is a really good one. I think it'll kind of wrap the whole thing up for us. And this is just in general about a judge's approach and reputation and things like that. So this one comes from Tim. Tim says, when I see a movie trailer that has Steven Spielberg as director or Tom Hanks as the lead actor, I think to myself, I bet I'm going to like this movie. How do judges not have a bias when a group comes on that has great designers or has traditionally been successful? Do groups that have been successful in the past have an advantage before they even start the show? What are your thoughts there? What's the training there? What's the message to the team on that kind of stuff?
Yeah, that is a great question, and that we talked about this at our judge meeting, exactly this type of scenario. Having that courage to perhaps go against what would have been a preconceived bias. It's human nature. It's going to happen that way. But with the judges on the roster, and certainly with any judge, it's just encouraging them to be confident enough in their process, confident enough in their preparation, confident enough in the professionalism that they have the courage to make those decisions. The beauty of this activity, and we've seen it as recently as this past year in, I think, Scholastic Open, every score given and every award given is not a lifetime achievement award. We understand things change. We understand every group is set up for success. Every group has equal opportunity for success. And the judges are there just to react to that show that day. While it can be a challenge, we continually encourage our judges to have that confidence, to trust their preparation, to trust everything they've done, to get them to sit in that seat, that when the red light's on, they can make the correct commentary, they can do their job that day. When it comes to making the scoring decisions, it's done based on all of that, the philosophy that supports it, based on all the craft training they've done, based on all the preparation they've done, not respective of who wrote the show that they're seeing. Names bounce around, groups bounce around, staffs move, so that type of continuity isn't necessarily always in place. Just trust your reaction, trust the process, and it should lead us to the right place.
I think our guys do a great job of always evaluating the show of the day in that particular performance and trying to leave all that other stuff to the wayside. And I think one of the things I'm most proud about the activity from all my days 20 years ago when I first got started in this, you can really see a lot of variance in the WGI activity. You see a lot of fluctuation between week to week. You see it between prelims and finals. You see it between year and year. Nobody has a monopoly on the one right way to do this or the best way to make a show really resonate with an audience. Everybody's fighting for it every year. And I think our judges do a phenomenal job of trying to read the show of the day, the performance of the day, and reward it to whoever was most deserving of that recognition at any given time. So I would say kind of to this, the proof is in the pudding. You can look at the results and you can look at the fluctuation and the variance and see a good, healthy record of the judges doing a phenomenal job of being in the moment with the ensemble while it's happening live.
Yeah, and to the movie analogy, Tom Hanks was in Joe versus the Volcano, and Steven Spielberg did do 1941. So they're not always direct correlation in directors and such.
Absolutely. And it's The only other thing I want to say on this are Mark Thurston, our director of percussion, who does a phenomenal job with the philosophy. These things are near and dear to him. Every time I've ever seen him speak at a clinic or speak at the judges meeting, he always leads with those two things. Any programming choice, any design choice can be successful in this activity, and that we always evaluate the performance of the day without any preconceived notion of historical success or who's on the design team or anything else like that. And so we're really healthy because Mark has always championed those two things as being at the true core of what WGI indoor percussion is all about. So that will certainly be a mantra that I think all of us will continue to carry forward forever in this activity.
Yeah, we on admin and we as a judge roster hope that motivates you and anyone to not only to join the activity, but just to continue maximizing your kids, maximizing yourself, maximizing your own creative process, because our plan is to reward it as it goes.
Nothing set in stone. Every show is a wide open field. So with that, I think we're going to wrap up for tonight. I'm incredibly excited about the season. I know we have thousands of instructors and designers and most importantly, performers and students and young people that are pouring everything they have into producing an amazing show. I can't wait to see everybody hit the floor this year and see what huge leap our activity takes. I know our adjudication team is going to be ready for it. I know our administration team is ready for it, and I just can't wait to see what the season looks like. Chris, thank you so much for joining us tonight and carving out some time to talk about all things adjudication.
My pleasure, Caleb. Always.
And everybody, just one little programming note, our next one of these that we're going to do is going to be happening on February 2nd. Our special guest for that will be Ike Jackson from Ayala High School. I'm sure it's going to be a fantastic conversation. Ike and I are total strangers, so I'm sure it's going to be really awkward once we get on camera together. That's not true. Ike and I go back a number of years, so we're going to have a great chat. If you have any questions for Ike ahead of time, do definitely shoot those in to me. You can send me an email or hit me up on Twitter or find me on Facebook and send me a message that way because we want to make sure that we're able to let that conversation go whatever direction you'd like it to go and whatever you'd like to learn from Ike or pick his brain about. It'll be awesome. All right, everybody, thank you very much for tuning in, and we'll see you again in a couple of weeks.